My question is, in terms of your economies, how does regulation and federal regulation affect the economic activity that your states can undertake?
I can jump in just real quick. For example, our Nature nuclear plant, the permitting process and the regulation are expected to take 7 to 10 years. And so what we're juggling with, do we step away from the old energy sources and into the new when the new's not quite ready? If we had that streamlined better, we'd get the regulations trimmed up a little bit. We might be able to have that up and running and have people employed.
If you are concerned about maintaining state regulatory primacy over the federal government, in the event a good Freedom Cities law is passed in the United States, what would you want that to look like in terms of regulatory carve-outs?
Well, the first thing I would say is exactly that, state primacy over specific rules that are currently held at the federal level where we can have the flexibility to find regulatory structure. When we have primacy as a state, we do things much, much more quickly and efficiently. And I'm not saying the standards are even changed, honestly. In a lot of the time, we're holding to the same standards. We just do it faster and better. And a lot of the time, that's what makes the difference.
Yeah, I would say, we could revisit that general regulatory sandbox with the understanding that it would be coupled with deregulation at the federal level. And so hopefully that alleviates some of the concerns that Senator Rothfuss expressed so well, that, we're not at risk of losing our primacy or our ability to regulate ourselves or to license our insurance companies, whatever the case may be. And if we have an opportunity to deregulate and maybe find some federal land that's not being used to its highest and best purpose to help along those lines, I think all those provide very good incentives. Recognize that we already have a very low tax structure in the state.
Hello and welcome. My name is Carl Peterson. I'm the Senior Manager for Special Projects at the Charter Cities Institute. I am joined here today by 3 different state senators from the state of Wyoming. We're going to discuss generally the concept of Freedom Cities. Our Executive Director, Founder and Executive Director, Dr. Mark Lutter, already had a great podcast with the Frontier Foundation President Nick Allen about the concept of Freedom Cities and what a great idea it is for America. In our sort of discussions and explorations of Freedom Cities and how they can help the United States, we sort of were looking at different places for implementation. A little bit of background: about 18 months ago, then presidential candidate Donald Trump was proposing new ideas for innovation in the United States. And one of these ideas was Freedom Cities, where the U.S. federal government would unlock federal land for the creation of new cities that had lighter regulatory environments to drive innovation. A lot of the federal land in the United States is in the West. In fact, almost all of the sort of unlockable federal land in the United States is in the American West. There are some states that have as much as 60 or 70% of them, or even more, that are controlled by the federal government. One of the states that has a substantial amount of federal land is Wyoming. Wyoming already, though, is showing itself to be an innovator in terms of energy, with a new nuclear plant being built in the sort of southwestern part of the state. So to that end, we started looking for different people in the state of Wyoming who were looking at leading innovation for the United States and for their state. And we came across these 3 gentlemen. So we'll go ahead and have you introduce yourselves. I think we'll start with Senator Dockstader. Would you please introduce yourself?
Well, I'm Dan Dockstader, Senate District 16, which is in the western side of Wyoming.
Great. And then Senator Bonner?
Yeah, Brian Bonner, Senate District 2, that's rural eastern Wyoming.
Great. And Senator Rothfuss?
Hi, Chris Rothfuss. I represent the Senate district that is in southeastern Wyoming and includes the University of Wyoming.
Great. So I think I'd love a little bit more information about your districts. You guys have told me kind of like where they are. I think maybe Senator Rothfuss, you've given me the most information, where the University of Wyoming is there. But I think maybe learning more about the economy of your district, maybe major concerns that you guys have for your districts around a number of things, including regulation, whether it's state regulation or federal regulation, and things like economic growth would be very good.
I'm happy to start. Yeah, my district is an urban district, urban for Wyoming, which is not urban for most places, and includes the University of Wyoming. So we obviously are a community that is largely focused on the University of Wyoming, trying to promote innovation, promote economic development, and you've got an R1 university that actively engages in research, tries to bring resources to Wyoming. We've got a heavy focus on energy research, water research, as well as life sciences. But I'd say energy is probably what we're primarily focused on. Communities around 30,000 in Laramie, Wyoming that I represent, and we are trying to grow. We are a part of the Front Range, so to speak, which has been experiencing significant growth in recent years, and we expect rather significant growth in the future. Are looking for ways to accommodate that, looking for good opportunities for employment, and really excited about an innovative future in our part of the state, where that type of economic growth, the type of growth that really brings in and retains the young people that we're developing out of the University of Wyoming, is essential to us.
Great. I think I'll just move to the left from my perspective. So, Senator Boner, would you please give some more info on your district?
Yeah, so Senate District 2 is a fairly rural district in east central Wyoming. A lot of agriculture, a lot of energy. We're one of the most active oil and gas producing areas in the state, and the oil and gas being one of our biggest industries in the state. And so we have that. We have a coal-fired power plant, which is scheduled to be converted to natural gas here in the next few years. So lots of energy production, both from producing the raw materials, the oil, the gas, to actually producing the electrons with a coal-fired power plant, which is then exported largely outside the state. Additionally, we've had quite a bit of uranium mining in the area. We used to have one of the largest uranium mines in the lower 48. Of course, that's been a very tough industry to be a part of in recent years, but now I think we're beginning to see that turn around, where we're recognizing that there are national security risks associated with importing uranium from places like Russia. We need to have a homegrown industry to provide for what I think is going to be a type of energy production for baseload dispatchable power. It's also very clean from an emissions standpoint. I think there's going to be a lot of increased demand for nuclear moving forward. And so we're very well versed with producing the raw materials and also generating electricity that's all generally exported elsewhere.
Great. That's fascinating. Senator Dockstader?
Two-county area, the northern part of my area. It ties in with ag and tourism. It's connected to the Jackson Hole tourism area. And a lot of people commute out of the valley I live in out there for work and employment, but also the valley that I live in. We manufacture aircraft and guns. And in addition to all that's going on in the ag economy on the southern part of my area, we have a coal mine, a power plant, and a natrium nuclear plant under construction. So that's my area.
I mean, that's great. So I think all of you sort of have raised a number of economic activities that sort of touch on issues of regulation, right? Tightly regulated areas, whether they're regulated by the state or the federal government. I think in particular, a lot of issues of federal regulation. Nuclear power, I think, is one of the biggest ones here. So, I mean, Senator Boner and Senator Dockstader, both of you, it sounds like nuclear power is huge for you guys in terms of whether it's resource extraction for uranium or whether it's the building of actually like the United States first new nuclear plant in decades. My question is, in terms of your economies, how does regulation and federal regulation affect the economic activity that your states can undertake, and how do you think in your experience as legislators you can improve regulation so that there are any necessary guardrails, but it doesn't unnecessarily stop economic activity and growth?
I can jump in just real quick. For example, our natrium nuclear plant, the permitting process and the regulation are expected to take 7 to 10 years. And so what we're juggling with, do we step away from the old energy sources and into the new when the new is not quite ready? If we had that streamlined better, we'd get the regulations trimmed up a little bit. We might be able to have that up and running and have people employed.
Right, that we're constantly running into challenges, federal nexus, whether it be oil and gas, for example, where most the actual land in my district is privately held, but you get that subsurface and it's about 60% owned by the federal government. And so it becomes very difficult for oil and gas production, makes a very complex situation. And also just our ability to export power is severely limited by how difficult it is to get a permit, say, to build a interstate transmission line, for example. We'd love to export more. We'd love to be able to retain more. But that becomes very difficult and very burdensome. And there's also new opportunities, I think, out there as well. When we got the raw resource, we've got the power plant going in Senator Dockstader's neck of the woods. But what would it take to begin to process some of that fuel and make it ready for these newer reactors, which require a different fuel than the traditional reactors? So I think we're versed in the restraints of being a federal land state. And I think that maybe makes us a little bit more sensitive to think things could be better and ways that we can innovate by deregulation.
And Senator Voner's area is very diverse in the fact that it's a strong part of our wind energy economy too. And they're mixing it up there where they can make sure that the ag land has its use and the wind complements it.
Great. My question is, Wyoming has for a long time been very reliant on like resource extraction. And both of you senators just touched on this idea of processing, right? So I think one of the big things that maybe Wyoming is sort of ready for is dealing with processing more minerals that it extracts from the ground. But I think maybe one of the things I'd love to discuss would be the potential, right? What are like the sort of, I hate this word, synergies that you can sort of have in an economy of extracting, uranium ore from the ground in Wyoming, then having it processed in Wyoming and then being used in Wyoming in like a nuclear plant. And how does that connect to education and maybe your district, Senator Rothfuss, in terms of potential programs at the University of Wyoming?
So we've been talking about that for quite a few years. I serve on the Minerals Business and Economic Development Committee and have for the past 15 years. And looking beyond extraction has been one of the real key focus points that we've had, and engaging with our School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming to do that in many ways has been a priority for us. So obviously extraction is critical to the Wyoming economy at this point, but if we can come up with value added approaches so that we're moving further up the value chain, it's going to be better for the people of the state of Wyoming and better for our economy. With nuclear in particular, we've talked about processing, reprocessing, enrichment. We've talked about, I think, every aspect of the value chain associated with nuclear, up to and including now our nuclear reactors. As we continue that discussion, really the last point that you discussed with Senators Boner and Dockstader comes into play, which is a lot of the challenges that we face are based on federal regulatory challenges where it's just incredibly difficult to get into that market. Nuclear is a particularly strong example where, just saying the word nuclear, you have to fill out about 5 forms at the federal level, and it takes 3 years to get the sentence complete. It's so burdensome that we really haven't found a good way to get into any of that middle area of value added. And you see a lot of politics at the federal level really playing into who ends up getting awarded with contracts and how they end up engaging. In the last year, we've had some excellent conversations, though, with companies that are interested in adding value, getting in that middle value chain, trying to fabricate nuclear fuels. And so we're excited about the potential for engaging in the full vertical instead of just either end of it, where we have a nuclear plant, we have the uranium, but all of that material has to go out of state prior to becoming usable in a facility.
Great. I mean, that sort of maybe brings me to my sort of next set of questions. In terms of looking at dealing with regulations, there are going to be federal regulations that are going to impact everyone in the United States, including the state of Wyoming. But then the state of Wyoming has its own set of regulations that it's dealing with among, all sort of different economic areas. Wyoming is actually one of the states, Western states in the U.S. have done a really good job at creating what we call, as lawyers, I'm a lawyer, unfortunately, but they've done a great job. Western states have done a great job at creating what we call regulatory sandboxes. And regulatory sandboxes, for our listeners, this is legislation that allows regulators and businesses to work together in a much more flexible manner than traditional regulation, so that businesses that are being regulated, but they think they have a good new idea or approach for creating a product or implementing a service of some kinds, it technically would violate regulation, but fundamentally it doesn't go against any of the public interest that causes regulations to be put in place in the first place, right? They can basically work hand in hand with the regulator to sort of basically be handheld through this process of creating this product or implementing this service. And then upon sort of successful completion of this process, the regulator might, kill or amend a regulation to make the future regulatory process much easier, much smoother. The state of Utah did a statewide regulatory sandbox for a number of things a couple of years ago, but Wyoming State has sort of implemented or tried to implement 3 separate laws. I think 3 of them ended up getting passed into law. One of them didn't get passed into law ultimately, that are regulatory sandboxes though, right? And so I kind of wanted to walk through these because I thought these were very interesting. And I assure you, it's not just interesting to lawyers. I think they're probably interesting to innovators as well, who have to deal with these things. So I'm actually very curious. I'd like to kind of start with maybe the VTOL aircraft regulations. So VTOL aircraft, vertical takeoff and landing aircraft in the United States, the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA, sort of governs all air traffic. It governs all law and regulation related to flight for the most part. States do have some degree of say in this as well. I'm actually very curious as to the VTOL aircraft regulations that were, I think, passed in 2018, and kind of how that places Wyoming in a better position for implementing sort of integrative aircraft designs.
We were setting those up just as a template. It's kind of new territory. People were cautious because they didn't know exactly what it was. But since then, since 2018, this is a very real and viable product that will have vertical takeoff and landing vehicles for short commutes. Take, for example, I was attending meetings in Dallas, and they were putting the proposal together. What would it take to take a 30-minute commute from the airport to turn it into 10 minutes with vertical takeoff and landing? We looked at it in regards to my area because I have an aircraft certificate manufacturing operation in my area, and the governor came over. We had several businessmen fly in, and we held a conference. We toured our airplane factory with the idea that we might be able to make VTOL work there. Nothing has moved forward since then, but that's why we were looking at it. There's opportunities there. When we first looked at it, there was a lot of caution because no one thought that was possible. But since then, it's very much possible. And Wyoming was laying the template. We'll get to medical and innovation sandbox in a minute, but there are things that Wyoming has stepped forward in before anybody else, probably because we just can. We're nimble. We can get this type of legislation through, but I'll let my colleagues further speak.
Yeah, especially with the vertical takeoff technology, it really is, I think our rural nature helps us out there quite a bit too. And that, obviously you need some corresponding deregulation with the FAA, but in terms of, general risk to the public, I think that, if you're going to do an experimental aircraft, Wyoming is the place to be, given the fact that we have lots of wide open space. And I think it really does leverage the current industries that we do have here.
I think something that's very interesting, like Howard Hughes, he was one of America's, big aviation pioneers. He used to fly his experimental aircraft, over LA, like downtown LA back in the day. And it's obviously not something that would be acceptable now. But, the Western U.S. has been a big innovator for aircraft and aerospace. Sure, the first flight in history, first powered flight in history happened where I currently live in North Carolina. But, you have major aircraft corporations basically are in the coastal sort of U.S. You have Boeing in Seattle, as well as a number of aircraft companies in Southern California. But as populations have become more and more dense in these areas, I think, there's a lot of businesses have turned to places that are maybe more sparsely populated to fly, experimental aircraft, right? So, I mean, Texas has Starbase Texas with SpaceX working out of there. I know, right, New Mexico has created they call it Spaceport America, I believe, trying to get space launches happening out of the state of New Mexico. So I think Wyoming trying to place itself maybe in the sort of VTOL aircraft area is not a bad idea at all. Relatively large state, relatively sparsely populated. I think the opportunities there are pretty big. I think this is especially the case if you're looking at not just VTOL aircraft, but also potentially drones. The FAA currently prohibits beyond line of sight drone flights. So you always have to be able to see where a drone is. This has made it so that some companies that have done drone innovations had to do them in Rwanda. So Rwanda, small country in Central Africa, was allowing entrepreneurs to be more innovative than the United States because they allowed sort of experimental flights. And at the time of this recording, There have been, unfortunately, a few, major scary air accidents that have happened. But with a proper regulatory environment, in a place like Wyoming, I think there's a lot of potential to run experimental aircraft in a very safe manner, that would benefit a lot of folks. But I do think that sort of is a good spot to maybe turn to the medical innovation sandbox that Senator Dockstader just mentioned. So, Senator, I'd love to hear about that and kind of what Wyoming was doing there.
That was just simply, we're setting up that template again for some new technical equipment that we could bring in. And Wyoming was a good place to test it, like, for lack of a better term, full body scans, but not as complicated as what you'd have if you walk into a hospital, something that you would get at a health fair, that type of thing. Have a readout and take it into your physician, your provider, and have some information on it. We were just simply setting up the template. And so now our Wyoming Department of Health has Medical Digital Innovation Sandbox application for a waiver for those who want to step in and start working on something like that. Again, Wyoming, you wouldn't think it'd be a place to do it. It was ahead and already has the application process there for you on the website to go in and start developing high-tech equipment.
Great. In addition to that, Wyoming also was looking at, did a fintech and blockchain sandbox. I think maybe this is like a big deal now that we're looking at a potential, once again, at the time of this recording, a potential U.S. Crypto reserve. So I think it's something that is very much in the news now. So what did Wyoming do to sort of place itself more in the lead on fintech and blockchain regulation?
So we started working that heavily over 7 years ago, 8 years ago now, on blockchain technology and financial technology. We created a task force early on in about 2018. I chaired that and have since chaired a select committee that we established in 2019 related to blockchain and financial technology. And some of our early legislation was, as you mentioned, this fintech and blockchain sandbox. The idea there being that we really do have a lot of flexibility as a state when it comes to property law and when it comes to banking under the dual banking system. We are not heavily regulated by the feds in a way that doesn't allow us to innovate. So we put in place a sandbox to ensure that we have the capacity for innovative business models to come into the state of Wyoming, come to our Division of Banking or our Secretary of State's office and say, hey, this technically breaks these regulations, or hey, this technically violates this portion of law, but we'll have the opportunity to bend those laws effectively and do things a little bit differently within the sandbox again. And there's some limitations there, but those limitations don't hold back that innovation. And then we can look at it, reflect on it as a legislature, and then adjust the laws as we need to. And we've been very successful in blockchain and financial technology for the past 8 years, bringing in some of the world's leading companies to Wyoming, just based on that innovative presence and the fact that we do have a great deal of control in that space that we don't necessarily have in others. And that's really what a lot of this comes down to, is where does a state actually have primacy and where can a state make decisions for itself without being preempted by the feds. And financial technology and blockchain space is an area where we realized we had a lot of opportunity to grow and innovate.
Great. I have another question, though. These are 3 really great, I think, pieces of legislation that address specific areas that having a better regulatory environment on the state level enables more innovation. I mentioned earlier Utah had a statewide regulatory sandbox implemented a few years ago. I know Wyoming attempted to do this in 2023. It ultimately did not pass. This bill did not pass into law. I'm curious, like, why do you think this bill didn't pass into law? Do you think Wyoming is going to take another stab at it to do a general regulatory sandbox? If not, why not? And if so, what do you think would cause a future bill to be able to pass into law?
So we did work that legislation a bit through my blockchain select committee and helped support that as it was going through the legislative process. The general innovation sandbox starts to become challenging because you really do have to figure out which laws it's okay to allow to be waived without threatening your primacy or your federal ability to engage. You've got organizations where a state is an accredited state. Sometimes accreditation is threatened. An example of that is in the insurance realm, where we were trying to do an insurance sandbox specifically in addition to the general innovation sandbox, and we failed on the insurance sandbox. We failed on that because there was concerns from our state regulators that if we did anything innovative in insurance, we would lose our accreditation as a state, and we would therefore not have accredited insurance companies. And honestly, we resisted that. Many of us on the committee did not agree, and we wrote legislation that would make sure that we weren't threatening that accreditation. But that's why that legislation failed. And when you get into the general innovation sandbox, you just start accumulating those types of opponents that are worried about their national accreditation or our primacy as a state. If we threaten our primacy, then the feds take back control. A good example of that would be on EPA and air quality, land and water quality, right? The state of Wyoming has taken primacy anywhere we can in those spaces through our Department of Environmental Quality. But if we take actions that are outside of what the EPA allows, then our primacy might go away, which is a very bad thing. That means that it's being regulated by the feds instead of regulated by the state. We do things a lot better than the feds do. So it was an aggregation of concern for us losing our control in these areas if we colored outside the lines, so to speak. We'll definitely be bringing it back. It's something that I anticipate talking about during this next interim again through the select committee, and it'll take time. We'll get there, but we have to make sure that we address these concerns that many of our colleagues have, and take a thoughtful approach so that we're not risking primacy where we actually have fought for and won it from the federal government.
So that's a very interesting point, and I think maybe that leads me to my next question. If you are concerned about maintaining state regulatory primacy over the federal government, in the event a good Freedom Cities law is passed in the United States, what would you want that to look like in terms of regulatory carve-outs, right? Like, what are maybe it could be top 3, top 5 areas of regulatory carve-outs that you think would best benefit innovation in the state of Wyoming for a Freedom City that was put in Wyoming?
Well, the first thing I would say is exactly that: state primacy over specific rules that are currently held at the federal level, where we can have the flexibility to find regulatory structure. When we have primacy as a state, we do things much, much more quickly and efficiently. And I'm not saying the standards are even changed, honestly. And a lot of the time, we're holding to the same standards. We just do it faster and better. And a lot of the time, that's what makes the difference. So instead of having the 7 to 10 years that Senator Dockstader mentioned, right, we get things done in say 3 months to a year on the same type of project, and that makes all the difference. So more places where we can have primacy and the state of Wyoming can regulate within the scope of the law, instead of having to go to federal agencies for decisions, would be the first. So decision-making authority going to state agencies where we ask for it and get the primacy would be my number one. If I could wave a magic wand and get it, we know that anywhere we have primacy, we perform a lot better. And then into the weeds a little bit, some nuances. When you start looking at the way EPA regulations are contemplated with air quality, land quality, and water quality, it's hard to aggregate across a space in a way that might be useful. And what I mean by that is, when you look at, for example, if you were to permit a city, as you're talking about, it would make sense as you're planning to permit the entirety of the city space and understand what the implications are that you could work within, and what the limitations are, and then regulate to that. Unfortunately, with the EPA, we don't get to do that. Every individual entity has to be permitted separately in a way that causes this endless path of challenging regulation, permit after permit after permit, where if we just said, hey, this entire city can produce this much CO2, this much NOx, this much SOx, this much ozone, and we could regulate it as an entity, then we could do a much better job, honestly, of addressing the potential implications and harms, but at the same time doing it efficiently, effectively, and quickly. So it's a win-win if we had that authority. And that's just one example that kind of comes from what we work on in the Minerals Committee, where we just don't have the authority to do things the right way as often as we'd like to.
Great. In terms of looking at this, I think that's really great. I think it does sort of, to me, in my mind, start bringing up, these issues of federal land ownership. Like I was saying earlier, the U.S. government controls a substantial amount of land in the U.S., most of it in western states. Pretty much everything that's federally controlled, beyond things like, military bases and a couple national parks in the east, almost all the rest of the land controls is in the western U.S. I grew up, my father's in the Air Force, so I grew up around a few different places, but I grew up mostly in Colorado, a little bit in New Mexico and South Dakota as well. So from, my perspective, I think I understand, like, when this issue comes up, I feel like I understand this issue fairly well. I think a lot of folks who aren't from the Western U.S. don't really understand, these issues of federal land ownership. You start talking about releasing federal land or selling off federal land or finding alternative uses for it. A lot of people sort of get very locked up. They immediately start thinking you're going to start to sell off like national parks, right? Wyoming has, Yellowstone National Park. It has the Tetons National Park. A lot of really beautiful places out in Wyoming, let alone the rest of the Western U.S. You sort of find out in discussions with people, they don't really understand that a lot of this land is locked up under the Bureau of Land Management. And the Bureau of Land Management, it can be great fun to go to BLM land if you're from the West. If you're maybe from a certain group of folks who likes to, maybe go out and shoot guns or go four-wheeling or something, BLM land is great fun. I've had it described to me before as it's like Mad Max. A lot less regulation out there for what you can do in terms of recreation. But the fact of the matter is there's a huge amount of land that's locked up under the Bureau of Land Management. And one of BLM's, reasons for existing is in part to sell off some of this land, right? It's not supposed to keep on to it forever, but its name was changed from like the Bureau of Land Sales. I think this is back from the 1970s. I don't know if my details are totally correct here, to the Bureau of Land Management. So in part that got the federal regulators thinking, we're not trying to, judiciously sell this land or use this land for, economic purposes or whatever. We're trying to manage this land, right? So there's a huge amount of lands locked up under the Bureau of Land Management that basically can't be used for anything. There can be, complex processes for applying for like oil and gas drilling, things like that. But there's a massive amount of BLM land in Wyoming. And so my question for you gentlemen is, looking at the huge amount of federal land in Wyoming, what federal land are you not trying to mess with? And what federal lands do you think should be unlocked for, the purposes of, not just the people of Wyoming, but, the people of the United States generally, for, economic development and purchase for regular folks, things like that?
That was part of a discussion, well, not just this year, but in years past. And the ultimate decision, at least my colleagues have probably confirmed that, is leave the national parks alone. There would like to be, in my area, the conservative-based people would like to have some discussion over the national forests. And they're not looking at it to sell, they're looking at it just for management purposes, more of a multiple use concept of management of those public lands.
Right. And I think if you're talking about Freedom Seas in particular, you're talking about a very small amount of acreage compared to half the 10th largest state in the union. And so you have places like Teton County, which are only 3% of the land in that county is privately owned. It causes all sorts of issues with the housing for workforce, people who support the tourism industry there. They have to drive every day either from Idaho or from Senator Dockstader's neck of the woods. So even some limited development for workforce housing where it's currently not allowed that would be helpful, not detract from the beautiful nature of that area, but really solve some serious issues in that community retreat. We constantly have to hear about in the legislature, because inevitably we have somebody who doesn't get their way at the local level who wants to fix it at the state level. And we have to deal with a bill or two like that every year, it seems like. But the challenges are significant, and it's not always necessarily the most well thought out policy. For example, in the southern part of our state, we have what's called the checkerboard, where every other mile wide section is owned by the federal government. And that's the result of the Transcontinental Railroad. That's how we developed that part of the country to get that railroad from one coast to the next. And it hasn't changed since. It's been 150 years. And it doesn't make any sense at all from a land management perspective. So lots of challenges associated with the federal nexus. And to your point, that the last major change we had in law was the 1970s, where we stopped, looking to sell off land. So we just have random parcels, even in my neck of the woods, which is 90% private property. It's just the parcels that nobody wanted. And they're just out there kind of isolated. They don't serve any purpose. And so obvious ways that holds us back economically. And there should be some ability to do some targeted development that doesn't risk our natural beauty in the national parks.
Well, I certainly don't support selling off lands, but I do support looking for opportunities to trade those lands with other lands, giving access to lands that might be needed, as well as multiple use of the lands, right? Better accessing them, as you said, unlocking them is something that we can certainly work towards so that we get back to multi-use of lands. We don't have to sell off the public's lands to achieve that result, and we can do some great things through land swaps, through better access, diminishing the time that it takes to get those permits that you mentioned. When things are running as they should, and when things are moving along intelligently, we can get a lot done. And I think that we've just honestly held back what can be done to unlock the resources and utility of those lands. We all have a tremendous number of people that are our constituents that do want to go out on those lands and hunt and fish and shoot and camp and hike. And that's a critical importance to the state of Wyoming across the state. But we also have tremendous need to utilize those lands, utilize the minerals and access the minerals underneath those lands. So we can do an awful lot better from a permitting standpoint, from an access standpoint. And getting back to the checkerboard that Senator Boner mentioned, that's about as inconvenient of a structure as we could have, and we've had it for well over a century. Aggregating those lands through a land swap would be of tremendous benefit both to federal management and state management and private property management, because if you're developing minerals, anytime you have any minerals that are underneath the federal lands that you're going to engage with in any way, you end up having to have a federal permit. So even though 50% of that land is private or state, you have to have a federal permit even to produce oil and gas from those lands, because there's not going to be any isolation. You're going to end up in a pooling situation where you're pulling some resources from those federal lands. So it's effectively locked up for permitting the entirety of the checkerboard. Those are the kind of things that we could sure do an awful lot more efficiently if we were able to work with BLM to swap some of those lands and do it in an intelligent and rational way.
Great. That brings me to my next question. In terms of what Wyoming can potentially do at the state level to encourage the creation of one or more freedom cities within the state, what are things that you think you'd be interested in doing to that end? Potentially, maybe a freedom city regulatory sandbox program at the state level. You just discussed working with BLM or maybe more broadly the Department of Interior for issues of land transfers. In addition to that, are there potential things like tax incentives that the state would be interested in doing for certain industries? In particular, I'm thinking here maybe could be more power production with like nuclear power or more refining for minerals like uranium, or even I think something that is a very sort of hot topic right now in the U.S. is the defense industrial base. And Senator Dockstader, you mentioned there's firearms manufacturing in your district. A number of these issues, this also kind of goes back in part to VTOL aircraft. VTOL aircraft and drones, very big issues for defense manufacturing and the defense industry. But in general, what sort of industries are you interested in attracting to Wyoming? How would you be interested in attracting them via a potential Freedom Cities program? And what's an approach you'd be interested in taking for that?
Yeah, I would say, we could revisit that general regulatory sandbox with the understanding that it would be coupled with deregulation at the federal level. And so hopefully that alleviates some of the concerns that Senator Rothfuss expressed so well, that, we're not at risk of losing our primacy or our, ability to regulate ourselves or to license our insurance companies, whatever the case may be. So if it's, have those carve outs and that prioritize any sort of federal efforts that would deregulate, I think that would go a long ways. And recognizing that we do have a lot of heavy manufacturing that has been, maybe starting in our minerals industry, oil and gas, coal, but they're diversifying into aerospace and into defense and doing a lot of similar things just for the different customers. And so we're building that organic capability as well throughout our private sector. And if we have an opportunity to deregulate and maybe find some federal land that's not being used to its highest and best purpose to help along those lines, I think all those provide very good incentives. Recognize that we already have a very low tax structure in the state. So I think deregulation is absolutely key.
Federal picture is changing to that too, and the concept that I noted on federal lands, multiple use concept. I think the scenario is coming good. We could definitely look at that, and Wyoming is nimble enough to make something happen under a workable federal relationship.
We've had a vision for a number of years discussed through our minerals committee in Wyoming to create a large industrial park, which is similar in concept to a Freedom City, perhaps in the northeastern part of the state, perhaps in the southwestern part of the state. We've got a few locations that would make sense where we can really be a hub for hydrocarbon synthesis and chemical synthesis in a way that no other state could do. And honestly, a lot of the challenges that we've had have been based on federal lands being a hindrance in planning something like that. Federal lands get in the way of projects like that. I could see an opportunity if we had the ability to engage with the federal government in a way that was cooperative instead of obstructive, for us to actually achieve one of those examples. And then you could imagine, northeastern part of the state, we have a tremendous amount of coal, we have a tremendous amount of natural gas, and we have a tremendous amount of oil just south of the region that we're talking about. If you have the capacity to bring all of those together in a large chemical processing facility, then the state of Wyoming can be adding tremendous value. Instead of just shipping out those raw materials, we can be synthesizing chemicals, plastics. We can do great things, but it takes an awful lot of resources. It takes complex planning, and it would take cooperation with the federal government on that. Building a city around that concept, or building up a city around that concept, could be very positive and beneficial for the state of Wyoming. And we have similar opportunities in the southwestern part of the state, down in Senator Dockstader's neck of the woods. We could be doing something exactly like that with inorganic chemicals, using the energy that's going to be available in the near future to do amazing things. So we really do have a tremendous potential for upside, where if this opportunity presents itself, Wyoming is positioned ideally to take advantage of it.
Senator Rothfuss is noting something that we've actually explored and toured a similar site in Canada with the idea that we can make use of it in Wyoming.
Great. Gentlemen, Senators Dockstader, Boner, and Rothfuss, it's been great to speak with you today, and I look forward to hearing more about what the state of Wyoming is going to be doing in the future in terms of, working on innovative legislation, attracting innovative industries, and building up the state potentially through Freedom Cities. Thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thanks for listening to the Charter City Podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.